All right, folks, winter's coming fast. Are you ready for it? Because it's right around the corner. Now, we all know that you can go out onto YouTube and find just a ton of videos about how to winterize your RV for the winter. Meaning, what are all the things that you need to do to protect your systems from freezing when it's sitting out in the cold over the next 6 months? But what about those of us who will be actually living in these things over the winter? What things do we need to do to protect our systems? And how do we make the inside warm enough to be comfortable throughout the entire winter without breaking the bank with propane and electricity bills? And let me tell you, as much as we've tried to avoid it, this is the third winter in a row that we're spending in this RV, and we've learned a lot along the way. Now, we realize that for many of you, this will be the first winter that you're spending in your RV, and we wanted to pass along all of those things that we learned. You all probably have the same questions we had about how to make those systems safe and how to make it comfortable inside. So we wanted to just show you guys exactly what we do to prepare for all of these cold winter months that are headed our way. Now, none of this stuff is rocket science, but you do need to understand some basic things about your RV, and there are some actions that you need to take before that temperature starts to drop below freezing. So stick with us for a few minutes here, guys, and we're gonna walk you through all of this, and I promise you won't regret it. Now, with all the things that we're going to talk about here, the one thing that I could not imagine going through a cold winter without is this skirting that you see behind me. Everything else that we're going to talk about after this will be a constant uphill battle and sometimes nearly impossible to accomplish without one of these skirts. Now, the first thing you have to understand about your RV when it comes to the skirting is that there is a lot of heat in your underbelly, and we need to be able to trap and maintain as much of that heat as possible. So if you were to peel back that corrugated sheeting that's up underneath of your rig, you'd see that your heat ducting runs pretty much all throughout. Now, not only does that heat ducting obviously carry that heat from the furnace to the inside of your rig, but it also radiates heat out and helps prevent your plumbing lines and your tanks from freezing. Now, don't get me wrong here, it's not gonna be a sauna up underneath your rig, even with this skirt, and it doesn't need to be. So there's no need to have, 15 different heat lamps down there. All we need is to retain just that little bit of heat that's being radiated out from your heat ducting into the underbelly. And on top of that, we're preventing as much heat as possible from radiating through the floor and just out into the open air, which will consequently keep the inside of your rig warmer. Now, having said all of that, on those really, really cold nights, those below zero type of nights, you may still need 1 or 2 heat lamps down there, but in general, they're not necessary because the skirt will help trap all of that heat all by itself. Now, let's talk briefly about the types of skirting that is available out there. So by far, the do-it-yourself method is going to be the cheapest. You can use things like foam board, heavy-duty canvas, or sheets of vinyl. It really doesn't take much to trap that heat under there. The next kind of level of skirting will be the pre-made or off-the-shelf type of skirting that you can buy from places like Easy Snap. Now, these aren't super cheap, but they're also not the most expensive type of skirting either, but they're still super effective. And finally, if you want to spend the money on it, you can get a custom skirt that is made specifically for your RV. Now, again, by far, that will be the most expensive option, but a lot of times, you can get them color coordinated and they just tend to last a lot longer than some of those other do-it-yourself options. We opted to get an additional piece that wraps around the cap end of our rig. And while it's not completely necessary to have that additional piece, it is nice to be able to use it as kind of a storage area. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough that if you will be in a cold climate for an extended period of time, the skirt is a must-have. Without a skirt around your rig, all of that heat that's being radiated out from the underbelly will simply be whisked away by the slightest breeze that comes along. So in order to not be battling the rest of these tips that we're going to talk about, do yourself a favor and get some sort of a skirt around your rig. Okay, so now let's talk about freshwater hoses. So everybody's seen this type here. This is just your typical freshwater hose that most people use. Now, this kind of hose isn't gonna last more than about 3 or 4 hours in below freezing temperatures before it freezes bulges and starts leaking all over the place. Now, on the other hand, you could opt for a heated hose. This is a Camco heated hose that we bought about 3 years ago. We've never had any issues with this. And what I really like about these hoses is that they're thermostatically controlled. So I can plug it in when the weather starts to get cold, and it will stay off until temperatures drop down to about 45 degrees. At that point, the hose kicks on, it starts warming that water, and then it will cycle on and off just enough to keep that water inside from freezing. Now, it's not gonna give you hot water. Don't have any thoughts about that. It's just gonna keep it warm enough, like I said, to keep it from freezing and bursting. All right, now if you opt to just go ahead and stick with the typical freshwater hose, really the only thing you can do here is just make sure that you completely drain this hose every time you use it. Either that or stick it up underneath of your rig and put a heat lamp on it maybe so that it just never gets to that point of freezing. But my recommendation is to just empty it after every use. Now, of course, what that means is you'll need to be using your freshwater tank as well. So fill your freshwater tank up. Once you're done, walk the hose out, drain all the water out of it and put it away. Just keep in mind that your freshwater tank may or may not be heated. The key here is, again, having a skirt to maintain as much heat up under your rig and in your underbelly as possible, and to keep that freshwater tank relatively full of water. Those two things combined should keep that freshwater tank from freezing up. Now that brings us to what to do with your water filtration system if you have an external one, meaning one that sits outside, or maybe even if you have a water softener. So there's really only two options here. As you can see in here, first of all, I'm just gonna ask that you forgive the state of my pass-through here. We recently ordered a new RV, and so this one's just in a little bit of a disarray because we're just in sort of a transition period. But as you can see, I've got my filter in here. I just move it into the pass-through area during the winter time. That way I just don't have to worry about it. The first winter that we spent though, I did have it outside. I had it underneath the rig, inside of the skirt. And then whether or not I needed it, I don't really know if I ever did, but I had a heat lamp that I pointed on it, and that heat lamp would just come on overnight when the temperatures were at its coldest, and I never had an issue. Now, as you can see, I did have to modify a little bit over here. I had to get a hole saw and drill a couple of holes in to get the hoses through, but that was pretty simple to do. And since the wet bay and the pass-through are both heated, I wasn't worried about cold air going back and forth between the two. So basically, our recommendation is to get your water filter inside if you can, and then again, if not, just put it under the rig behind the skirt with a heat lamp on it, maybe just overnight. Same goes for your water softener if you have one of those. All right, now let's talk about those septic lines. Septic lines are gonna be probably where you spend most of your effort managing all these systems for your RV over the winter. And that's really just because you use your septic on a daily basis, whether it's the bathroom or the kitchen, you know, the shower, the sinks, all of that. You use that on a daily basis, and it becomes a little bit more involved trying to manage that over the winter. Now, what we've done in the past and what we recommend is to go ahead and leave those septic lines connected, but the key here is that you have to completely drain those hoses every time you dump your septic tanks. That means that when you are dumping your tanks, you wait until all of the water has completely emptied out of the tanks, and then you walk down your hose, completely get all of the water out of it, and then shut your dump valve. And then once all that water is out of there, again, you can just leave it connected because there's just really nothing left in there to freeze that's gonna damage the hose. Now, the alternative to that is that you can buy heat tape for these septic hoses, but that's just not something that we do or recommend, because if that heat tape fails and your line freezes, then you're just gonna have a terrible mess to clean up the next day. So again, it's just not something we recommend. We recommend just leaving them connected, draining them as you normally would, but once you're done draining them, make sure you completely walk out that septic hose to remove all of the water. Now let's wrap up talking about all the things you need to do outside your rig by addressing our propane tanks. So number one, you're gonna go through a lot of propane over the winter for your furnace. And like the septic hoses, you're gonna spend a lot of time managing your propane system so that you don't run out in the middle of the night. Now, I've done a whole other video on my propane system and how I kind of rearranged everything to make managing this system throughout the winter a little bit easier. And I'll go ahead and put that link down in the description area of the video. But basically what I've done is I've moved my propane tanks outside so that I can get some heat lamps on them. And here's why that's important. Propane gas turns into a liquid at about minus 40 degrees. Now, for most people, that is not going to be an issue. Most of us are not going to see weather that cold. The problem is once you get down into the teens and below, the pressure inside of these tanks does dip down quite a bit, and you're not able to fully utilize the propane liquid that's in the tank. So that means when the pressure goes down inside of these tanks, it's not sending enough propane to your appliances, which ultimately means that those appliances will be starved of fuel, and your furnace is likely not going to run very efficiently like that, if at all. So again, I'm not going to go in depth on how I rearranged my propane system because I do have that other video, but I just wanted to kind of show you what that looks like out here. I've got my propane tanks here. These are my normal 30-pound tanks. I also have two 40-pound tanks that I can easily swap out. And then I have a set of heat lamps that are pointed at the tanks just to keep them a little bit warmer than they normally would be, to ensure that that pressure in the tanks stays up and my appliances don't get starved for that fuel. Now, beyond what I've done, there are a couple more options for keeping your propane tanks good to go over the winter, and number one would be buying heat blankets for them. Now, that's certainly an option. It's just not something that I wanted to spend the extra money on. Those things can be fairly expensive, you know, 150 bucks, 200 bucks, something like that, and that's per tank. However, if you're willing to spend the money, it is a really good option. Another thing to keep in mind is the more liquid that's in these propane tanks, the better. Now, I'm not saying that you need to get these things filled every day, but you might want to consider just getting them filled a little bit more often than you normally would. All right guys, so let's move on to tank heaters. So not all RVs are gonna have tank heaters on them, but if you do have them, you definitely should use them, because last thing anybody wants is that your tank freezes up and now you can't drain it, or worst case scenario, it freezes, it bulges, it bursts, and then you get what's inside of the tank coming outside of the tank in a non-preferred method. So if you have them, let's use them. Now, I'll be honest with you here. I don't really know when these tanks cycle on and off. All I know is that they are thermostatically controlled. Doing a little bit of research on the Google machine tells me that most people think that they turn on at about 45 degrees and then they cycle on and off to maintain a temperature above freezing. Now, what I can tell you is that whenever the weather is predicted to get down below freezing, I will always turn my tank heater switch on. But that doesn't mean that my tank heaters are actually energized and heating my tanks. All it means is that they are ready and standing by for that temperature to drop. Now, to be completely honest with you, I don't think these tank heaters have ever actually energized, and that all comes down to the fact that I do have a skirt out there and it traps all of that residual heat up in the underbelly. You see how a lot of this comes back to having that skirt installed? It really does help. Now, for those of you who do have tank heaters, you're most likely going to have those heaters on your septic tanks, so your gray tank and your black tank, but you may or may not have one on your freshwater tank. That would be something you would need to look into your individual owner's manual to find out. I know that, again, looking around on the internet, not all RVs have heaters on their freshwater tank. And then for those of you who don't currently have tank heaters, you can buy them just like off of Amazon and install them yourself. Now, that can be a little tricky because you will have to take back that corrugated sheeting up underneath on the underbelly to access the tanks, to get the heaters physically installed, and also to get them electrically installed. Don't forget that you will have to tap into the 12-volt DC system of your RV somewhere in order to power up those tank heaters. So bottom line here is, if you have the tank heaters, make sure you use them. There's no reason not to, because the fallout from having a frozen tank is really just too much to deal with. Now let's change gears here and talk a little bit about the things that you can do inside of your RV to stay comfortable when it's cold outside, but also to minimize those electric and propane expenses. So the first, and I think most obvious thing that you can do, and forgive me, I'm just gonna have my notes here with me because I don't wanna miss any of this, but the first and most obvious thing that you can do is just wear more clothing, right? Layer that clothing. The difference between summer and winter is in the winter, you can always put on more clothing to help keep warm, whereas in the summer, you can only take so much of it off, right? So the key in the winter will just be to layer that clothing until you're comfortable. So I don't know if you can tell right now, but I do have a thermal undershirt on here and then just a regular long sleeve shirt on top of that. And for most of the day, that's comfortable for me. Typically during the day, we've got the thermostat set at about 66 degrees, but in the evening, somewhere around dinner time, the thermostat is programmed to start going down kind of in increments. I think right around dinner time, it goes down to about 64 degrees. And then by the time we get to when we want to go to bed, it's all the way down to about 60 degrees. Now, let me tell you, setting your thermostat down overnight really has a lot of benefits, right? So obviously, number one, it will save you in energy costs. But aside from that, and maybe just a little bit off topic, is that it is clinically proven that sleeping in a colder temperature is better for your mental and your physical health. So do yourself a favor and program that thermostat to get down to maybe the low 60s at night. And I think you'll find that, again, you'll save more money and you'll probably sleep better. Now, to go along with layering your clothing, one important tip is to make sure you wear slippers when you're inside. So number one, come on guys, slippers are just comfortable, right, to walk around in. But number two, they will help keep your feet warm, help keep your feet off of the cold floor. And hey, again, another bonus here is that slippers are proven to help ward off or fight sicknesses such as colds and flus. So I think wearing slippers is just kind of a win-win-win all the way around. Now let's talk about something that can really help out on those especially cold days and nights. And what I'm talking about here, using your electric fireplace or using portable electric space heaters. Both of those are great options to supplement how you heat the inside of your rig. Now, I'll be honest with you, heating with electric heaters is not cheap, but something to consider here is that if you're parked somewhere where they don't meter your electric, then hey, who really cares, right? You can use all the electricity you want. Now, I feel like I would be negligent if I didn't talk about some safety tips here, because electric heaters can be a fire hazard. So, number one, you want to keep them out of reach of small children. I think that's probably obvious to just about everyone, but also think about your pets. Like us, we have 2 cats wandering around in our rig, and I know that they sometimes get up on these counters, especially up here where the TV is, and if I had a portable heater up there, there's a decent chance they might knock it over, or they might decide to just lay down right in front of it, which probably isn't good either. So make sure you keep them away from pets and kids. The second safety tip here is don't ever plug them into power strips. Power strips can be very easily overloaded. Sometimes we're not really paying much attention to all of the things that we have plugged into those. Plus, power strips a lot of times just aren't built for the amount of current that these electric heaters draw. For example, a lot of these portable heaters out here go up to about 1500 watts. Well, that equates to about 12 amps. Many of the power strips are only rated at about 15 amps. So as soon as you plug in that electric heater, you're already using up about 80% of what that power strip is rated at. Plugging in anything else beyond that has the potential to overload it, and again, it will become a fire hazard. Third safety tip is to make sure that you don't ever coil up that power cord for the electric heater. Like I said, those things draw a lot of current, and that current equals heat. So when you coil those cords up, there's nowhere for that heat to dissipate to, and again, they're gonna get even hotter, becoming a fire hazard. Real pro tip here is do not start a fire inside of your rig just to make it warmer inside. All right, the last safety tip here for these electric heaters, make sure that your heater has some sort of safety switch in it. And what I mean by that is some kind of tilt switch. Those safety switches will automatically cut off power if that electric heater happens to fall over for some reason. So a lot of these heaters have just got simple buttons on the bottom. So when you set it down on a hard surface, that button automatically pushes in and it allows the heater to operate. And then vice versa, when you pick it up or if it tips over, that switch then deactivates deactivates the heater and prevents a potential disaster. Other heaters may have some sort of internal switch that senses whether it's upright or level, but no matter how it does it, just make sure that your heater has some sort of safety switch on it. Okay, here's an easy one. Rugs. Rugs are great in the wintertime, and they have really two main benefits in your RV. So number one is, just like your slippers, they'll keep your feet off of that cold floor, because let's be honest guys, who wants to get out of bed first thing in the morning, step down onto a cold floor? I know I don't like it, and I know that I also don't like having my slippers right next to my bed either. So a nice little rug on the floor beside your bed is great in the wintertime. The second benefit of these rugs is they actually act as insulation, meaning they will keep a lot of that heat that's inside of your rig from radiating out through the floor to the outside. Now, don't feel like you gotta go to a rug swap in Dubai to get a decent rug for the wintertime. Boy, I really screwed that one up, huh? It's called a rug flop, number one. And number two, they are normally held in Bahrain, not in Dubai, and they're held as kind of a social event slash rug sale. You can get some cheap, nice rugs just off of sites like Amazon or maybe Wayfair, or even at your local Walmart, right? You don't need anything expensive. You just need to get something down on the floor to help keep that heat inside of your rig. Okay, now for a tip that really isn't so easy. Not that it's hard, it's just kind of something you have to stay on top of constantly. And I'm talking about your windows, or even a sliding glass door if you have one. We have a sliding glass door in our rig, and it lets through a ton of cold air in the wintertime. Now, the absolute best way to prevent as much of that cold air from coming in as possible is to have dual pane windows, but I realize not everybody's willing to spend money on that. But that's not your only option here, right? We just need to figure out how to insulate these windows the best we can. And one of the most effective ways of doing this is to use Reflectix or some other similar type of insulating material in all of your windows. You can buy big rolls of these things on Amazon. They're not very expensive. Certainly you'll make up that cost in energy savings. So you just buy one of these big rolls, measure each individual window, and cut these sheets of Reflectix down to fit them. Now, it doesn't have to be the name brand Reflectix. Again, it can be any similar material. Heck, you could even use blankets or towels if you wanted to. It would be a little bit more difficult to secure them to the windows, but really any insulating material you can put in the window is going to have a huge benefit. And not only will these materials insulate your windows, but it will drastically cut down on the amount of condensation that builds up on them. And we're going to get to the condensation part here in just a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. Now, one thing I will say about using any kind of insulating material in your windows is that when you have those bright sunny days that aren't too cold, I would recommend you take all of that stuff out of your windows, let that sunlight come through and heat up your rig naturally, right? We all complain about this in the summertime. These RVs are just like little heat boxes. So make sure you use that to your advantage in the wintertime. Okay, so on the topic of windows, the next tip has to do with sealing up those air leaks, because just putting on the insulating material isn't good enough if you haven't sealed up those air leaks. Now, I don't know about you, but every single one of the awning type windows on our RV has got about a ½ inch gap between the windows that you can see straight through. You can clearly feel that outside air coming in both the winter and the summer. And not only that, but let's not forget about these slides, right? There are gaps around the edges of those slides as well. As a matter of fact, in our bedroom, we have some really big gaps down at the bottom. They're probably about 1 inch wide, and you can feel that air coming in on your legs and your feet if it's super hot or super cold outside. So we just shove old socks in there, done. Now, you can use whatever you want to fill those gaps. You can get some expanding foam. Don't get the spray expanding foam. That's kind of a permanent, semi-permanent thing. But get some little foam balls or blocks or something. You can put them in there. Paper towels, whatever. Just as long as you plug those holes. Bonus tip, kind of within a tip here, however, is that if you are going to plug up these holes around your slides, which I recommend you do, you just got to make sure that you remove them before you try and operate those slides. So that's something that you might want to add to your pre-departure checklist and put it on there before you bring in the slides. Just put on there, remove old dirty sock from the bottom of the bedroom slide, whatever it is that helps you remember. Okay, here's one to me that's kind of just a no-brainer. In my opinion, you need a dehumidifier in your RV all year round, but I think it's especially important in the wintertime for two main reasons. So number one, we talked about that condensation that builds up on your windows. Well, that condensation is likely to build up in a lot of different places. The windows, it's gonna build up on the walls, especially in the corners of your slides. I've even seen it a little bit on the floor, or at least dripping down onto the floor. So condensation can be a huge problem. Now, the second benefit that comes out of having a dehumidifier comes from the relationship between how much humidity is in the air versus how that makes your skin feel. And what I mean by that is when you are in a cold temperature, if the humidity is high, the temperature is actually going to feel colder than what it really is. So what I always say, and what I always try to do in my own home, my own RV, is to maintain a humidity level of somewhere between 40 to 50%. That's just the most comfortable humidity level for really any climate. Okay, now a dehumidifier is not going to completely prevent condensation building up, especially on your windows. It does a pretty good job with the walls and the floors, but the windows, you're still gonna have issues. And keep in mind that you've got that Reflectix or that insulating material in there, so that condensation is now being trapped. I will say this though, the combination of the dehumidifier and the insulating material in the windows will help to drastically minimize that condensation. However, it's still going to build up, and it's still something that probably every 3 or 4 days you need to take a look at your windows. So pull that insulating material out and just wipe up any condensation that gets in there so that you don't get the mold and mildew growth. All right, so that wraps it up for all of the kind of normal tips. I got a couple of bonus tips here, and I call them bonus tips because I don't think they're completely necessary for you to live in your rig during the winter, but they can certainly help out if you are willing and able to tackle them. So this first bonus tip has to do with the insulation that's running all throughout the underbelly of your rig, or should be running all throughout the underbelly. Now this is a fun one to tackle, and by fun, I mean it's a total pain in the ass, but it can be worth it, especially if you're missing insulation down there, or if it's gotten wet and old and it's just not effective anymore. Now, fortunately, this is not something you need to do every year. It really only needs to be done once, and then, maybe check it every couple of years. And it's really a lot easier if you have an extra set of hands to help you on this one. So I'm going to point out just a few things here that I would look at specifically if you're going to tackle this job. Now, remember, this will require you to remove that corrugated sheet from up underneath of your underbelly, but I think this is really just a kind of a great opportunity for you to see exactly what's going on up there in your underbelly as far as, insulation, electrical, hydraulics, tanks, plumbing, all of that stuff. It really gives you a good idea of how all that's put together down there. So anyway, what I would look at, number one, is do you have any insulation missing? Like I said, there should be insulation pretty much all throughout your underbelly. And if you have any spots that are missing, I would go ahead and get some insulation and stuff it in there. The second thing I would look for is any wet insulation. When insulation gets wet, it's really just not effective anymore. You want to keep it as dry as possible. So if you find any wet insulation, you really need to pull that out and just replace it. Not only is it ineffective, but it promotes the growth of mold and mildew, and you really don't need that for health reasons. You don't need that up underneath of your RV. The third thing to look for or at is the thickness of that insulation. As time goes by, the older that insulation gets, it's gonna tend to mush down a little bit. It's just the natural way. So what we recommend is you need 6 inches of insulation underneath of there. So however you want to insulate that, whether that's rolls of insulation or the blow-in type insulation, you need at least 6 inches of it. And that segues right into the fourth part of this, which is the R value of the insulation. So the higher the R value, the better. The air has an R value of 1, and then whatever material you can find is better than that, right? It's got a higher R value. We recommend at least an R value of 19 to go up into the underbelly of your RV. The last thing I would look for while you're down there, and I hope you don't find this, but burned insulation. If you see insulation that looks burned, that's something you need to look into right away, immediately. You can't say, I'll get back to that later. Burned insulation is a good indication that maybe you have some sort of electrical fault down there. Let me tell you, bare wires and insulation do not go well. That is a fire hazard just waiting to happen. So again, this is not an easy task, and it's easier if you have two people, but it is something that I recommend that everybody does. It doesn't have to be this winter. You can wait till the spring to do this, but getting up there and just taking a look at that underbelly and kind of inspecting everything and learning what's up there is a huge benefit as an RV owner. All right, the last tip we're gonna get here to is all about monitoring the temperatures in all of the places where you should be monitoring temperatures. So they make some really good weather stations out there that have got multiple sensors on them, and they come with a head unit that will show you all of the temperatures on one display. Now these are really good to have around. We personally use the new Wintor system. We've had a couple of these over the past probably 10 years, and they're really good, and the sensors that go outside are really durable. Now as you can see here, we're missing a couple of sensors. That's our own fault because we forgot to bring them out when we got underway. We didn't have them on our checklist, so I'm down a couple of sensors. These are just a really good thing to have hanging up on your wall or maybe somewhere on a countertop where you can keep a good eye on them. The other way you can go is to get smart temperature sensors. So we just purchased this Go V system. It's got 3 different sensors on it, and I really like these, and I'm glad we're upgrading to them because they provide a little bit more functionality. And what I'm talking about here is remote monitoring. Now let's talk about where you might want to put these. So the first winter we were in this rig, like I said before, I kept my water filter and my water softener both outside underneath the rig behind the skirt. And then I just put a temperature sensor right on top of the water filter. And then I could always tell if I needed to turn on a heat lamp to keep that from freezing overnight. Now last year and this year, I haven't had to worry about that because I put all of my water stuff in the pass-through, which is heated. But I do keep a temperature sensor in that pass-through just to make me feel better, right? But what I'm gonna do this year is behind the wall in the pass-through, I actually have access to the top of my septic tanks. And so I'm gonna take a sensor and I'm gonna just place it right on top of one of those septic tanks, because that for me this year is my big worry. I don't have to worry about fresh water, but it's gonna be, I think, significantly colder where we're at than where we've been in the past. And I really just wanna make sure I don't have any problems with my septic tanks. So I will put a sensor down there so that I can monitor that 24/7, and I can get alerts when that temperature gets to somewhere that I'm just not comfortable with. All right guys, so that's gonna wrap it up. I know I threw a lot at you. I tried to condense it as much as possible so we could get through it in a reasonable amount of time. I really hope you got something out of this. What my goal for all of this really was to give you some ideas to help you live in this RV over the wintertime without being miserable, because we really love this RV life and we don't think that, you know, some cold temperatures should ruin that for anyone. The last thing we want is for any of you to give up on this RV life because you had a rough winter. It's not necessary, and I know, again, that was a lot of information, but most of it's really easy, right? So again, we don't want you to give up on this if you have a rough winter, because we really hope to see you guys out there on the road. Okay, so again, I really hope you got something out of this video. If you did, if you liked it, please make sure you hit that like button, give us a thumbs up, and we definitely invite you to make comments down below on what you thought about the video. If you have anything to add, if you have any topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future, just put all that down there. Promise we'll get back to you. But more importantly, make sure you hit that subscribe button to make sure that you get notified of our future videos. And as always, happy camping and stay safe out there, guys.